My son had been gone for less than 4 hours when I realized I was about to lose more than just him. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am 72 years old, and until that day, I believed the worst pain a mother could experience was standing beside her son's casket. I was wrong. The funeral home was quiet when I arrived. Soft music drifted through the hallway. Friends and relatives spoke in hushed voices. Fresh flowers lined the entrance, filling the air with a sweet scent that somehow made everything feel even sadder. I held my purse tightly and walked toward the chapel where my son David's service would begin. Every step felt heavier than the one before it. David had been my only child. After my husband passed away years earlier, he became the center of my world. Not because I depended on him, because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He called every Sunday. He stopped by whenever something needed fixing around my house. He never forgot my birthday. He never forgot Mother's Day. Most importantly, he never let me feel alone. Now he was gone. As I entered the chapel, my eyes immediately moved toward the front row. Family always sat in the front. That was how it had been at every funeral I had ever attended. I expected to see a place reserved for me beside my grandchildren and my daughter-in-law, Jennifer. Instead, every seat in the family section was already occupied. Jennifer sat in the center between the children. Her sister sat beside her. 2 cousins occupied the remaining seats. I stopped walking. For a moment, I assumed there had been some mistake. Perhaps someone would notice and move. Perhaps another chair would be added. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked in my direction. I remained standing there longer than I cared to admit. Finally, one of the funeral attendants approached me with an apologetic smile. "Ma'am, there is a seat available right over here." He pointed toward the 3rd row. Not the front. Not with the family. Several rows back. I thanked him quietly and sat down. My hands trembled slightly as I looked toward the front of the room. Jennifer never turned around. She seemed completely focused on the service preparations. I told myself not to read too much into it. Grief affects people differently. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Maybe she simply had not noticed. That explanation comforted me for almost 10 minutes. Then Jennifer stood and walked toward the podium to speak with the funeral director. As she passed my row, our eyes met briefly. She saw exactly where I was sitting. She said nothing. She continued walking. Something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Just confusion. The service began. Friends shared stories about David. Former coworkers described his kindness. Neighbors talked about his generosity. I listened through tears as memory after memory filled the room. Every story reminded me of the boy I raised and the man he became. Several times, I glanced toward the front row. Jennifer remained surrounded by family. My grandchildren sat beside her. I should have been sitting with them. I should have been close enough to hold their hands when they cried. Instead, I felt like a visitor attending someone else's funeral. After the service ended, guests gathered in the reception area. People approached me with hugs and condolences. I thanked them politely. Then I noticed Jennifer standing near the entrance speaking with several relatives. As I approached, I heard her say something that made my heart sink. "We need to start moving forward now. Things cannot stay the same forever." The words themselves were not cruel. Under different circumstances, they might have sounded reasonable. But something about the way she said them unsettled me. It felt less like grief and more like a decision already made. Jennifer looked up and noticed me standing there. For a second, an awkward silence passed between us. Then she offered a small smile and said, "David would want us to move forward." I nodded because I did not know what else to do. But as I stood there surrounded by mourners and flowers and memories of my son, a question formed in my mind that would change everything. If Jennifer was already moving forward, where exactly did she think that left me? The days following the funeral passed in a blur of silence. Every morning, I woke up expecting to see David's name on my phone. For years, he had called almost every day. Sometimes it was only for 5 minutes. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Now the silence felt louder than any conversation ever could. During the first week, I told myself Jennifer simply needed time. Grief affects everyone differently. I remembered losing my husband and how difficult it had been to speak with anyone. That explanation helped me avoid thinking too much about what happened at the funeral. Then small things began to change. At first, they seemed insignificant. A family group message continued without me. A school event involving my grandchildren happened without anyone mentioning it. A weekend gathering took place at Jennifer's house, and I learned about it afterward through social media photographs. Individually, None of those moments felt important enough to question. Together, they created a feeling I could not ignore. One afternoon, I decided to call Jennifer. I wanted to check on her and the children. The call went to voicemail. I left a warm message. The next day, I called again. Another voicemail. 3 days later, I finally received a text. It was brief. "We are doing okay. Just trying to adjust." I stared at the message for several minutes. It was polite, respectful, even, yet it felt strangely distant. Before David passed away, Jennifer would have called. Now everything seemed reduced to short messages and careful wording. A week later, I drove to the neighborhood where my grandchildren attended soccer practice. David never missed a game. After his death, I wanted the children to know someone was still there cheering for them. I arrived early and found a seat near the field. The afternoon sun was bright, and the air carried the familiar sounds of parents talking and children laughing. For the first time in days, I felt something close to normal. Then I saw Jennifer. She noticed me almost immediately. Her expression changed for a brief moment before she walked over. "Margaret," she said politely. "I did not know you were coming." "I wanted to support the kids," I replied. She nodded. "That is nice." The conversation should have continued naturally. Instead, an awkward silence settled between us. Finally, Jennifer glanced toward the field and said, "The children have been having a hard time. I am trying to keep things stable." I understood that. What I did not understand was why her words felt like a warning instead of an explanation. After practice ended, I waited for my grandson to run over and hug me. He always had before. This time Jennifer called both children toward the parking lot before they reached me. They waved politely and followed her. I stood there holding a small bag of snacks I had brought for them. Watching their car pull away, I felt a sadness deeper than grief. Grief came from losing David. This feeling came from watching pieces of my family slowly move beyond my reach. That evening, I sat on my back porch long after sunset. The neighborhood was quiet. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. I thought about the front row at the funeral. I thought about Jennifer's words. I thought about the growing distance that seemed to appear everywhere I looked. Then a troubling realization entered my mind. Perhaps what happened at the funeral was not an isolated moment created by grief. Perhaps it was the first visible sign of something that had already begun. And for the first time, I started wondering whether Jennifer was not simply moving forward without David. Perhaps she was trying to move forward without me as well. About 3 weeks after the funeral, I experienced something that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. Until then, I had been giving Jennifer the benefit of every doubt. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself she was overwhelmed. I told myself that distance did not necessarily mean rejection. Then one evening, a photograph changed everything. It happened by accident. A friend from church called to ask whether I had seen the memorial post Jennifer shared online for David. I told her I had not. Social media had never been important to me, and lately I had been avoiding anything that reminded me of how much I missed my son. After we hung up, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the post and began scrolling through dozens of photographs. Some showed David as a child. Others showed him with Jennifer and the children. There were family vacations, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings. Each picture captured a different chapter of his life. I smiled through tears as I looked at them. Then I noticed something strange. In photograph after photograph, I was nowhere to be found. At first, that did not seem unusual. Nobody appears in every family picture. But the more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Many of those events were gatherings I had attended. In several cases, I clearly remembered standing beside David when the photograph was taken. Yet somehow, I had disappeared from the final image. I clicked on one particular picture from a 4th of July barbecue 2 years earlier. I remembered it perfectly. David had been standing between Jennifer and me. The original photograph sat framed on a shelf in my living room. I knew exactly what it looked like. But in the version Jennifer posted, the image had been cropped. David and Jennifer remained in the center. I was gone. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I walked into my living room and picked up the framed photograph. Side by side, the difference was undeniable. Someone had intentionally removed me. My hands began to shake. Not from anger. From disbelief. Why would anyone do that? What possible reason could there be? The next morning, I met my longtime friend Helen Carter for coffee. Helen had known David since he was a teenager. She listened quietly as I explained what I found. When I finished, she sighed and looked down at her coffee cup. The reaction caught my attention immediately. "What is it?" I asked. Helen hesitated. "There is something I have been debating whether to tell you." My stomach tightened. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. A few months before David passed away, Jennifer attended a fundraiser with several women from town. At one point, the conversation turned to family. Helen paused again. Jennifer said she felt trapped between the past and the future. She said she wanted a fresh start someday. I listened carefully. None of that sounded particularly alarming. Then Helen continued. Someone asked whether that included extended family. Jennifer laughed and said that eventually everyone has to move on. The words landed heavily. Eventually everyone has to move on. It sounded remarkably similar to what she said at the funeral. Suddenly, I realized this attitude had not appeared after David's death. It had existed before. The drive home felt longer than usual. For the first time, I stopped viewing recent events as isolated incidents. The funeral seating, the unanswered calls, the distance from my grandchildren, the missing photographs, the comments about moving forward. Each piece pointed in the same direction. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a painful possibility had taken shape in my mind. Jennifer was not simply rebuilding her life after losing her husband. She was slowly building a new life that no longer included me. After my conversation with Helen, I stopped looking for excuses. That did not mean I stopped hoping. A mother never completely stops hoping. But hope and denial are not the same thing. For weeks, I had been telling myself there must be another explanation for what was happening. Now I was beginning to accept a painful reality. Jennifer was creating distance on purpose. The question was why. A few days later, I found another piece of the answer. It arrived unexpectedly on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sorting through old paperwork in my home office when I came across a storage box David had left in my garage years earlier. I had not opened it since before his passing. Inside were ordinary things. Old tax records, home improvement receipts, sports memorabilia from high school. Then, beneath a stack of folders, I found a photo album. I carried it to the kitchen table and began turning the pages. Most of the photographs were exactly what I expected. Family vacations, birthday parties, school events. There was David as a little boy learning to ride a bicycle. There was David holding his first child in the hospital. There were countless memories spanning decades. What caught my attention was something else. In almost every photograph, there was a clear pattern. Family, togetherness, connection. David always seemed happiest when everyone was included. The more pages I turned, the more obvious it became. He never divided people into sides. He never created distance. If anything, he spent most of his life bringing people together. That realization stayed with me throughout the afternoon. Later that evening, my granddaughter called unexpectedly. She was only 11 years old, and her voice immediately lifted my spirits. We talked about school, friends, and her upcoming science project. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again. Then she asked a question that made my heart ache. "Grandma, are you mad at Mom?" I sat quietly for a moment. "Why would you ask that?" There was hesitation on the other end of the line. Then she answered, "Because Mom says everybody needs space right now." Space. Another word I had been hearing more and more often. Moving forward. Adjustment. Space. Different words. Same message. I chose my response carefully. "I am not mad at anyone," I said gently. "I love you very much. And I love your mother too." My granddaughter seemed relieved. We spoke for another few minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I sat alone in the kitchen thinking about what she had said. Children often reveal more truth than adults realize. Nobody had told her there was conflict, yet she had sensed it anyway. The following Sunday, I attended church as usual. After the service ended, several members of the congregation approached me. Most offered kind words and support. Then one conversation caught me off guard. A woman I barely knew mentioned seeing Jennifer recently. "She seems determined to build a fresh start for the children," she said. The comment sounded harmless. Then she added something else. "She told us she is trying to simplify family obligations." I smiled politely, but the words stayed with me all afternoon. Family obligations. The phrase felt strangely cold, as though relationships were tasks on a checklist rather than people who cared about one another. That evening, I sat on my porch watching rain clouds gather in the distance. For the first time since David's funeral, a different thought entered my mind. Perhaps this was not really about grief. Perhaps it was not about healing either. Perhaps Jennifer had been waiting for an opportunity to reshape her life long before tragedy struck. David's absence had simply removed the one person standing between her plans and their execution. The realization hurt. Yet it also brought clarity. If that was true, then I had been misunderstanding the situation from the very beginning. I thought I was watching a grieving widow struggle to move forward. What I might actually be witnessing was someone quietly deciding who would and would not be allowed into the next chapter of her life. And judging by everything I had seen so far, I was no longer part of the future she envisioned. 2 months after David's funeral, I stopped trying to understand Jennifer's intentions and started paying attention to facts. Feelings can be misleading. Facts are harder to argue with. The truth was simple. I saw my grandchildren less often. I received fewer calls. Family events happened without my knowledge. Every week seemed to create a little more distance than the week before. One Saturday morning, I decided to organize a closet in my bedroom. It was something I had been avoiding for years. Inside were old boxes filled with memories from every stage of David's life. School awards, birthday cards, family photographs. As I sorted through them, I came across a small wooden box I did not recognize. The lid was worn, and David's handwriting appeared on a faded label attached to the side. My heart immediately tightened. I carried the box to the kitchen table and carefully opened it. Inside were dozens of personal items. Ticket stubs, notes, photographs, small keepsakes collected over many years. Then I found something that stopped me completely. Folded neatly beneath a stack of photographs was a sealed envelope. Written across the front were 3 simple words. For Mom. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. My hands trembled. David had always been thoughtful. The kind of person who planned ahead. The kind of person who wrote birthday cards weeks early because he never wanted to forget someone important. Yet seeing those words after his death felt overwhelming. I sat quietly for a long time before opening it. The letter inside was handwritten. Familiar. Warm. Unmistakably David. He began by explaining that he had written the note years earlier after the death of a close friend. The experience had made him think about life and family. What followed brought tears to my eyes. David wrote about childhood memories, family vacations, Sunday dinners, the lessons he learned from me after his father passed away. He thanked me for never making him choose between family members. He thanked me for teaching him that relationships required effort and patience. Then I reached a paragraph that changed everything. David wrote that no matter what happened in the future, he hoped the people he loved would remain connected. He specifically mentioned Jennifer. He mentioned the children. And then he wrote something I would never forget. Mom, if life ever changes in ways none of us expect, promise me you will remember that you belong with this family. You always will. I read those words 3 times. Then a 4th. Tears blurred the page. The room around me seemed to disappear. For weeks, I had been questioning my place in the family. David had answered the question years before it ever existed. Later that afternoon, I called Helen. My voice shook as I read portions of the letter aloud. She listened quietly. When I finished, neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, she said something that stayed with me. Margaret, that letter is not really about the past. It is about what David wanted for the future. She was right. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something unexpected. Strength. Not because the letter solved my problems. It did not. Jennifer still seemed determined to create distance. The children were still seeing less of me. Nothing had changed externally. Yet something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt confused about where I belonged. David had already made that clear. That evening, I placed the letter back inside its envelope and set it beside my favorite photograph of him. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees outside my kitchen window, I realized something important. Jennifer may have been rewriting the future in her mind. But David had already left behind a reminder of the family he believed should exist. And for the first time since his funeral, I began to wonder whether his voice might still have the power to change what happened next. The letter remained on my kitchen table for several days. Every morning, I read a different section before starting my day. Not because I was searching for answers. Because hearing David's voice again, even through ink on paper, brought a comfort I had not felt since losing him. Yet the more I read, the more one thought kept returning. If David cared so deeply about keeping the family connected, why did Jennifer seem determined to do the opposite? The question followed me everywhere. One afternoon, about 3 months after the funeral, I received an unexpected invitation. Jennifer was hosting a small memorial dinner to mark what would have been David's birthday. The message was brief and formal. Still, It was the first invitation I had received in weeks. I accepted immediately. On the evening of the gathering, I arrived carrying one of David's favorite desserts. The house looked exactly as I remembered. The same front porch, the same flower beds, the same basketball hoop David had installed for the children years earlier. For a moment, standing in the driveway, memories washed over me so strongly that I almost turned around and went home. Inside, family members gathered around the dining room. The atmosphere was polite, but noticeably different from the warmth that once filled the house. Conversations felt careful, controlled, as though everyone was avoiding something they could not quite name. During dinner, people shared stories about David, his sense of humor, his generosity, the way he always found time for everyone. I listened quietly, occasionally adding a memory of my own. Then I noticed something interesting. Every time someone mentioned the importance of family, Jennifer's expression seemed to tighten ever so slightly. It was subtle. Most people would never have noticed. I did. After dessert, several guests moved into the living room. I remained behind, helping clear plates. Jennifer stood at the kitchen counter, organizing leftovers. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I decided to break the silence. "The children seem to be doing well," I said gently. Jennifer nodded. "I am trying my best." "I know you are." She looked surprised by my answer. Then I continued. "David would be proud of how hard you have worked for them." For the first time that evening, some of the tension left her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. A long silence followed. Then Jennifer spoke again. Everything changed so fast. Her voice sounded tired. Not angry, not defensive, just exhausted. "Sometimes it feels like everyone expects me to keep things exactly the same." I listened carefully. "Do they?" I asked. She stared down at the counter. "Maybe not. But I feel responsible for building a future for the children." Suddenly, many of her actions began making more sense. Not all of them, but some. Jennifer was not simply moving away from the past. She was running toward a future she felt obligated to create. The problem was that somewhere along the way, she started viewing family relationships as obstacles instead of support. Before I could respond, my grandson entered the kitchen carrying a small box. "Mom," he said excitedly, "I found Dad's memory box." Jennifer immediately looked uncomfortable. My grandson placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside were photographs, cards, and handwritten notes. Family members slowly gathered around. Then my granddaughter pulled out a folded piece of paper. "What is this?" she asked. Nobody answered. She unfolded it and began reading aloud. It was a short note written by David years earlier. In only a few sentences, he described what family meant to him. Near the end, he wrote something that caused the entire room to fall silent. "No matter what happens, I hope the people I love never forget they belong to one another." The words hung in the air. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. I looked at Jennifer. For the first time since the funeral, she looked genuinely shaken. And in that moment, I realized David's voice had just entered the conversation in a way neither of us could ignore. For days after the memorial dinner, I could not stop thinking about the look on Jennifer's face when my granddaughter read David's note aloud. It was not guilt. At least not entirely. It looked more like someone hearing a truth they had spent months trying not to hear. The memory stayed with me. So did the silence that followed. Something had shifted that evening. The distance between us still existed, but for the first time, it felt less certain. About a week later, Helen called and invited me to lunch. We met at a small restaurant near the lake where David used to take his children on summer afternoons. As we sat by the window, Helen listened while I described what happened at the memorial dinner. When I finished, she smiled gently. Maybe Jennifer is finally starting to understand what she has been doing. I wanted to believe that, but experience had taught me not to confuse a moment of emotion with real change. People can feel something deeply and still continue exactly as before. After lunch, I decided to drive past the old baseball field where David played as a teenager. The place had barely changed. The bleachers were newer, but the field looked the same. Sitting in my car, I found myself thinking about all the years David spent connecting people. Whenever there was conflict in the family, he was the one who made the phone call. Whenever someone felt left out, he noticed. Whenever tensions appeared, he quietly brought everyone back together. The realization hit me harder than ever before. Jennifer and I were not simply grieving David. We were living in the empty space left behind by the role he once filled. A few days later, something unexpected happened. My granddaughter called again. This time her voice sounded excited. She told me about a school presentation she would be giving the following Friday. Then she asked if I planned to attend. The question caught me off guard. Of course I would love to come, I said. There was a brief pause. Good, she replied. Because I already told everyone you would be there. I laughed for the first time in weeks. On Friday morning, I arrived early and found a seat near the front of the school auditorium. Parents and grandparents slowly filled the room. As students began entering, I noticed Jennifer several rows away. She saw me too. For a moment, I expected the same awkward distance that had defined our recent interactions. Instead, she walked over. I am glad you came, she said quietly. The words were simple, yet they carried more meaning than she probably realized. I would not miss it, I answered. Jennifer nodded and sat beside me. Not in another section. Not several rows away. Beside me. Throughout the presentation, we watched the children together. We applauded together. We smiled at the same moments. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a solution. But it was the first time since David's funeral that we occupied the same space without an invisible wall standing between us. Afterward, as families gathered in the hallway, my grandson ran toward us carrying a project he wanted to show. Without thinking, he stepped directly between Jennifer and me and wrapped an arm around each of us. The gesture lasted only seconds, yet it felt strangely important. Children often understand things adults complicate. As I looked down at him, another thought entered my mind. For months, Jennifer and I had been focused on our own grief, our own fears, and our own assumptions. Meanwhile, the children wanted only one thing. They wanted the people who loved them to remain connected. That evening, as I sat alone at home, I took David's letter from the drawer and read it again. This time, one sentence stood out more than any other. It was not about loss. It was not about memory. It was about belonging. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the next conversation between Jennifer and me might finally reveal the truth both of us had been avoiding. The conversation happened sooner than I expected. About a week after the school presentation, Jennifer called and asked if I would meet her for coffee. Her voice sounded calm, but there was something different beneath the surface. Not tension, not distance, determination. The kind that appears when someone finally decides to say something they have been carrying for a long time. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the same place where David once surprised me with lunch on my birthday years ago. When I arrived, Jennifer was already there sitting by the window. A cup of coffee rested untouched in front of her. She looked tired, not physically tired, emotionally tired, as though she had spent months carrying a weight that had finally become too heavy. After we ordered, neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Finally, Jennifer looked out the window and took a slow breath. I owe you an explanation. The words caught me off guard. For months, I had imagined this conversation. Yet hearing those words still surprised me. I remained quiet and let her continue. After David died, I was terrified. Tears appeared in her eyes almost immediately. Everyone kept asking how I was doing. Everyone kept asking about the children. Everyone expected me to have answers. She paused and looked down at her hands. I felt like if I stopped moving forward for even one day, everything would fall apart. I listened carefully. For the first time, I was hearing the fear beneath the behavior. Jennifer continued. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that the only way to survive was to take control of everything. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. The future, the children, the house, every decision. Her voice broke slightly. Even relationships. The last word lingered between us. Neither of us needed to explain what it meant. After a long silence, I finally spoke. Why did you push me away? Jennifer closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. Because every time I looked at you, I saw David. The answer hit me harder than anything else she could have said. Not because it excused what happened, because it made painful sense. You knew him longer than I did, she said quietly. You knew every version of him. The little boy, the teenager, the man he became. Being around you reminded me of everything I lost. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The noise of the cafe faded into the background. Suddenly, the distance of the past few months looked different. Not justified, but different. Jennifer had not been trying to erase me because she hated me. She had been trying to escape her own grief. The problem was that grief does not disappear when people are removed from your life. It simply changes shape. Jennifer wiped away a tear and continued. Then I started believing that if I created enough space, the pain would get smaller. She smiled sadly. It did not work. I thought about the funeral, the missing seat, the unanswered calls, the cropped photographs, the children. Every painful moment suddenly fit into a larger picture. Not one of cruelty, one of fear. Fear can damage relationships just as effectively as anger. Sometimes more. We talked for nearly 2 hours. For the first time since David's death, neither of us was protecting ourselves behind polite conversations or careful distance. We were simply being honest. As we prepared to leave, Jennifer reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. It was a copy of the note my granddaughter had read from David's memory box. Jennifer looked at it for a moment before handing it to me. I have read this every day since the memorial dinner, she said softly. Then she added something I never expected to hear. I think David would be disappointed in how I handled things. I looked at her carefully. For the first time since the funeral, I believed we were finally standing in the same place. Not at the end of the story, but at the beginning of something better. The months that followed did not erase the pain. Grief does not work that way. It does not disappear because people finally understand one another. It simply becomes easier to carry when you are no longer carrying it alone. After my conversation with Jennifer, small things began to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but steadily. The children started calling more often. Family dinners slowly returned. The distance that had once seemed impossible to cross became smaller with each passing week. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 6 months after David's funeral, Jennifer invited everyone to her house for dinner. The invitation itself felt ordinary, yet something about it felt important. As I drove there, I realized it was the first time since David's death that I was not arriving with anxiety. I was simply arriving as family. When I entered the dining room, I immediately noticed something that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The table had been arranged differently than before. Every chair had a place. Every place had a purpose. And directly beside the children was a seat reserved for me. Nobody announced it. Nobody pointed it out. It was simply there, waiting. Jennifer noticed me looking at it. She smiled softly. I thought you might like that spot. For a moment, I could not speak. Then I nodded and took my seat. Throughout dinner, stories flowed naturally. The children talked about school. Family members shared updates about work and vacations. Every now and then, someone mentioned David. This time, the room did not become quiet when his name came up. Instead, people smiled. They remembered. They included him in the conversation the way families do when love remains even after loss. After dessert, my grandson disappeared upstairs and returned carrying a framed photograph. He placed it in the center of the table. It was one of my favorite pictures ever taken of David. In the photograph, he stood between Jennifer and me during a family picnic many years earlier. We were all laughing. Nobody posed. Nobody looked perfect. We simply looked happy. Dad liked this one, my grandson said proudly. Everyone studied the picture. Then Jennifer looked at me. There is something I want to say. The room became quiet. She took a deep breath. For a long time, I thought moving forward meant leaving certain things behind. Her eyes filled with emotion. I was wrong. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Jennifer continued. The more I tried to create distance, the more I realized I was separating the children from people who loved them. I was also separating myself from people who loved me. Her voice trembled slightly. I cannot change how I handled those first months. But I am sorry. The apology was simple, honest, unrehearsed. I looked around the table, at my grandchildren, at the family photograph, at the faces of people who had endured the same loss in different ways. Then I thought about the empty seat at the funeral, the unanswered calls, the loneliness, the fear. All of it had felt permanent at the time. Yet here we were. Not because someone won, not because someone lost, because truth finally replaced assumptions. I reached across the table and gently touched Jennifer's hand. We were both grieving, I said quietly. We were just doing it differently. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on my porch beneath the stars. The night air was cool and peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing in a neighboring yard. I thought about David. I thought about his letter. I thought about the sentence that had carried me through the darkest months after his death. You belong with this family. You always will. In the end, that was the lesson I carried forward. Belonging is not a chair at a funeral. It is not a place sitting at a table. It is not a photograph or a family title. Belonging is knowing your love still matters even when life changes. As I looked up at the night sky, I realized something that brought me more peace than anything else. I had not lost my son and my family. I had lost my son. But because of the love he left behind, I had found my family again.